Hello, beautiful soul. Welcome to this sacred space where your sensitivity isn't something to apologize for, but something to honor. As you settle into this moment, perhaps you're feeling that familiar weight of being too much or too sensitive in a world that often seems to reward emotional armor over emotional authenticity. You're here because you've carried the burden of apologizing for your depth, for your tears that come too easily, for your heart that feels everything so intensely. You've heard the voices telling you to toughen up, to get thicker skin, to not take things so personally. And maybe, just maybe, you've started to believe that your sensitivity is a flaw that needs fixing rather than a gift that needs protecting. Tonight, I want to offer you something different. I want to give you permission to stop apologizing for the very thing that makes you beautifully human. Permission to feel without explanation. Permission to cry without justification. Permission to care deeply without needing to defend that caring. Permission to be moved by beauty, by pain, by the endless complexity of human existence. You don't need to earn the right to feel. You don't need to prove that your emotions are valid. You don't need to explain why your heart responds to the world the way it does. Your sensitivity isn't a weakness masquerading as strength. It's a strength that our world has forgotten how to recognize. As we begin this journey together, know that there's no pressure here, no timeline for healing, no expectation that you'll emerge fixed or less sensitive. And this is simply an invitation to explore what it might feel like to inhabit your sensitivity with pride rather than shame, with curiosity rather than judgment, with compassion rather than criticism. Your gentle heart that feels everything so deeply, that's not a problem to solve. That's a doorway to a richer, more connected way of being human. And tonight we're going to walk through that doorway together, honoring every step of the journey. Let's talk about what sensitivity really means, beyond the cultural messaging that has taught us to see it as a liability. In our daily lives, sensitivity might show up as being the person who notices when someone's energy shifts in a room. It might be feeling overwhelmed by loud noises, bright lights, or chaotic environments. It might be absorbing the emotions of others like a sponge, carrying their pain as if it were your own. Maybe you're the one who cries during commercials, who feels deeply moved by music, who can't watch the news without carrying the weight of the world's suffering. Perhaps you're the friend everyone comes to when they need someone to truly listen, to hold space for their pain, to offer the kind of understanding that can only come from someone who feels deeply themselves. But here's what happens in a world that often misunderstands sensitivity. We learn to apologize for these very qualities. We learn to say, "I'm sorry I'm so emotional," or "Sorry, I'm just being too sensitive." We develop elaborate strategies to hide our tears, to minimize our reactions, to make ourselves smaller so that others feel more comfortable. The psychological research tells us something fascinating about sensitivity. Dr. Elaine Aron's groundbreaking work on highly sensitive persons reveals that approximately 20% of the population possesses what she calls sensory processing sensitivity. This isn't a disorder or a flaw, it's a genetic trait that has been preserved across species because it serves an important evolutionary function. Sensitive individuals are the ones who notice danger first, who pick up on subtle environmental changes, who can read the emotional temperature of a group. Carl Jung understood this deeply when he wrote about the profound gifts of those who feel intensely. He recognized that sensitivity often comes with heightened intuition, deeper empathy, and a richer inner life. What our culture has labeled as being too sensitive is often actually being appropriately sensitive to a world that has become desensitized. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability and shame has shown us that those who feel deeply are often the ones who love deeply, who create deeply, who contribute most meaningfully to the world. Yet, we've been taught to see our depth as a burden rather than a gift, our emotional responsiveness as a weakness rather than a superpower. The truth is, your sensitivity isn't something that happened to you. It's something that is part of your essential nature. It's woven into the fabric of who you are, and it serves functions that extend far beyond your individual experience. Sensitive people are often the ones who create the art that moves us, who offer the compassion that heals us, who notice the beauty that others miss. But because we live in a culture that often values emotional control over emotional intelligence, productivity over presence, and surface-level interactions over deep connection, sensitivity can feel like a liability. We've internalized the message that feelings are inconvenient, that crying is weakness, that being affected by the world around us is somehow a failing. Tonight we're going to challenge that narrative. We're going to explore the possibility that your sensitivity isn't something to overcome, but something to embrace. We're going to discover that the very quality you've been apologizing for might actually be one of your greatest strengths, and that the world doesn't need you to be less sensitive. It needs you to be courageously, authentically, unapologetically sensitive. This isn't about becoming impervious to pain or developing emotional armor. This is about learning to hold your sensitivity with the same reverence you would hold any other precious gift. It's about recognizing that in a world that often feels disconnected and numbed out, your ability to feel deeply is not just beautiful, it's necessary. As we transition deeper into this exploration, I want you to know that we're going to approach your sensitivity with the gentleness it deserves. There will be no forcing, no pushing, no trying to make you less sensitive. Instead, we're going to create a space where your sensitivity can unfold naturally, like a flower opening to the morning sun. Take a moment now to notice how your body feels as we talk about sensitivity in this new way. Does something in your chest soften when you hear that your sensitivity is a gift rather than a flaw? Does your breathing deepen when you consider that you might not need to apologize for feeling deeply? These small shifts in your body are your wisdom responding to truth. Your nervous system has been working overtime to protect you from the overwhelming nature of feeling everything so intensely. It's developed sophisticated strategies to help you navigate a world that often doesn't understand or honor sensitivity. Some of these strategies have been helpful. They've helped you survive in environments that felt unsafe for your tender heart. Others may have become burdensome, creating more suffering than they prevent. Tonight, we're not going to dismantle these protective mechanisms. We're going to thank them for their service and gently invite them to relax, knowing that in this space, your sensitivity is not only safe but celebrated. We're creating a sanctuary where your feelings don't need to be managed or controlled, where your tears don't need to be apologized for, where your depth doesn't need to be explained. This journey we're embarking on together is one of coming home to yourself. It's about returning to the truth that your sensitivity is not a mistake of nature, but a feature of your design. It's about remembering that before the world told you that you were too much, you knew that you were exactly enough. Before you learned to apologize for your tears, you knew that tears were simply your heart's way of speaking. As we continue, we'll explore the stories that have shaped your relationship with your sensitivity. We'll meet the parts of you that have been working so hard to protect your tender heart. We'll discover the gifts that your sensitivity brings, not just to your
own life, but to the lives of everyone you touch.
And we'll learn to hold all of it with the compassion and tenderness that your beautiful, sensitive soul deserves. For now, simply rest in the possibility that everything about the way you feel might be perfectly, beautifully right. rest in the
radical notion that your sensitivity isn't something to fix, but something to honor. Rest in the gentle truth that you have never been too much. The world has simply been too little in its capacity to hold the fullness of who you are. Tonight,
We're changing that story. Tonight, we're coming home to the gift of your sensitivity. At the heart of tonight's journey lies a simple but revolutionary truth. Your sensitivity is not a burden you bear, but a bridge you build. It's a bridge between the seen and unseen, between the spoken and unspoken, between the surface of life and its deeper currents. This bridge is not something you constructed to make life harder for yourself. It's something that was built into your very essence, because the world needs bridges. Think of sensitivity as a kind of emotional porosity, where others might experience life through thick glass. You experience it through open windows. Where others might hear only the melody, you hear the harmony, the discord, the spaces between the notes. This isn't a design flaw. It's a feature that allows you to perceive and respond to subtleties that others miss. But here's what happens when we don't understand the purpose of our sensitivity. We spend tremendous energy trying to close those windows, trying to thicken that glass, trying to turn down the volume on our emotional experience. We develop what I call sensitivity shame, the deep belief that our natural way of being in the world is somehow wrong or excessive. Tonight we're going to explore a different possibility. We're going to consider that your sensitivity might be less like a vulnerability and more like a superpower that you've been taught to hide. We're going to discover that what you've been calling being too sensitive might actually be being appropriately sensitive to an insensitive world. This exploration will unfold through stories and metaphors, through gentle inquiry and compassionate understanding. We'll meet the parts of you that have been protecting your sensitive heart, and we'll learn to work with them rather than against them. We'll discover the gifts that your sensitivity brings to your relationships, your creativity, your capacity for joy and beauty and connection. Most importantly, we'll learn to hold your sensitivity with the same reverence that you would
hold any other precious gift, because that's what it is, a gift.
not just to you, but to everyone whose life you touch, with your capacity to feel deeply, to notice what others miss, to respond with the kind of authenticity that comes only from those who are brave enough to remain open in a world that often rewards closing down. As we begin this deeper exploration, know that every word, every insight, every moment of recognition is happening at exactly the right pace for your unique journey. Your sensitivity has its own wisdom, its own timing, its own way of unfolding. We're not here to rush or force or fix anything. We're here to create space for your sensitivity to be seen, understood, and celebrated for the gift it has always been. The journey home to your sensitivity begins now with this first gentle step of recognizing that there is nothing about the way you feel that needs your apology. You are not too much. You are not too sensitive. You are exactly as you are meant to be. Maybe you know this moment. You're in a meeting at work, and someone makes a comment that feels sharp, dismissive. While everyone else seems to brush it off and move on, you feel it land in your chest like a stone dropping into still water. The ripples spread through your entire being, and suddenly you're questioning everything: your contribution, your worth, your place in that room. Later, when you try to explain why you're upset, someone says, "You're being too sensitive. They didn't mean anything by it." And you find yourself apologizing, not for their words, but for your response to them. Or perhaps you recognize this scene. You're watching a movie with friends and there's a moment of genuine beauty, a sunset, a reunion, an act of unexpected kindness. Your eyes fill with tears because something in your soul responds to beauty the way flowers respond to sunlight. But when you glance around, you notice that no one else seems moved. You quickly wipe your eyes, feeling embarrassed by your emotional response, muttering something about allergies or being tired. You apologize for feeling what your heart naturally feels. That moment when you're scrolling through social media and you see a story about injustice, about suffering, about the struggles of people you'll never meet, while others might read it and scroll past, you find yourself carrying their pain as if it were your own. Your chest tightens, your breathing becomes shallow, and you feel the weight of the world settling on your shoulders. When you mention it to someone, they tell you to just stop reading the news or don't let it get to you so much. And again, you find yourself apologizing for caring too deeply about the pain of others. Maybe you've experienced walking into a room and immediately sensing the tension that others seem oblivious to. You can feel the unspoken conflict between two people, the sadness hiding behind someone's smile, the anxiety radiating from someone trying to appear calm. This emotional radar that picks up on subtleties feels like both a gift and a curse. You want to help, to acknowledge what you're sensing, but you've learned that others often don't want their emotions to be seen so clearly. So you carry this awareness silently, apologizing internally for knowing too much, feeling too much, seeing too much. Or that experience of being in a crowded, noisy environment, a busy restaurant, a shopping mall, a concert, and feeling
overwhelmed by the sensory input. While others seem energized by the chaos, you feel your nervous system going into overdrive. The sounds feel too loud, the lights too bright, the energy too intense.
you find yourself making excuses to leave early, apologizing for not being able to handle what others seem to enjoy effortlessly. These moments share a common thread. They're all times when your natural sensitivity has been met with the message that your response is inappropriate, excessive, or wrong. Over time, these experiences layer upon each other, creating a narrative that your way of being in the world is somehow flawed. You begin to believe that your tears are too quick, your caring too deep, your awareness too sharp, your boundaries too fragile. But here's what I want you to consider tonight. What if none of these responses were wrong? What if, instead of being too sensitive, you were simply being appropriately sensitive to a world that has lost touch with its own sensitivity? What if your tears in response to beauty are exactly the right response to beauty? What if your awareness of others' emotions
is a gift, not a burden?
What if your need for quieter spaces and gentler environments is wisdom, not weakness? Your sensitivity serves functions that extend far beyond your personal experience. When you feel the tension in a room, you're serving as an early warning system for the group. When you're moved by beauty, you're keeping alive the human capacity for wonder. When you absorb others' pain, you're demonstrating the kind of empathy that heals the world. When you need to step away from overwhelming environments, you're honoring the wisdom of your nervous system. The pattern we've been exploring, feeling deeply, then apologizing for that feeling, is what happens when natural sensitivity meets a culture that has forgotten how to hold space for the full spectrum of human emotion. It's not that you're feeling wrong, it's that you've been taught to judge your feelings as wrong. It's not that you're too much, it's that you've been in spaces that were too little in their capacity to hold your fullness. Understanding this pattern is the first step toward freedom from it. Once you recognize that your sensitivity isn't the problem, the lack of understanding around sensitivity is the problem, you can begin to relate to your emotional responses differently. Instead, of apologizing for your tears, you can honor them as your heart's way of speaking. Instead of hiding your awareness of others' emotions, you can recognize it as a form of emotional intelligence that the world desperately needs. Let me tell you a story about a lighthouse keeper named Luna, who lived on a small island where the most magnificent lighthouse had stood for generations. This lighthouse was different from others. It didn't just emit one steady beam of light. Instead, it pulsed with waves of luminescence that could detect the subtlest changes in weather, the smallest boats in distress, the faintest calls for help across the vast ocean. Luna had inherited this lighthouse from her grandmother, who had inherited it from her grandmother before her. Each keeper in the family line had possessed the same unique gift, the ability to sense not just the obvious storms and clear dangers, but the subtle shifts in wind patterns, the barely perceptible changes in the emotional weather of the sea, the quiet distress calls that other lighthouses missed entirely. For the first part of her life as the lighthouse keeper, Luna took pride in her work. When fishing boats would return to harbor, the captains would thank her for guiding them safely through waters that looked calm on the surface but held hidden currents. They would tell her how her lighthouse had helped them navigate not just the physical challenges of the sea, but the emotional ones too. The fear that crept in during long nights, the homesickness that could cloud their judgment, the interpersonal tensions that could make a crew vulnerable to mistakes. But as years passed, the world around Luna's island began to change. Newer lighthouses were built with technology that focused only on the most obvious navigational needs. These lighthouses had bright, efficient beams that cut through darkness, but couldn't detect the subtle emotional currents that Luna's lighthouse had always sensed. The newer technology was praised for its simplicity, its reliability, its lack of what the mainland authorities called unnecessary complications. Soon, Luna began receiving complaints about her lighthouse. "It's too sensitive," the maritime authorities told her. "It responds to things that aren't really problems. It picks up on every little shift in the atmosphere." The newer lighthouses don't have these issues. They only light up when there's a real emergency. Luna tried to explain that the little shifts her lighthouse detected often prevented the big emergencies from happening in the first place. She shared stories of boats she'd guided away from dangerous emotional waters before anyone realized they were in trouble. But the authorities remained unconvinced. "You're overthinking it," they said. Not everything needs such a detailed response. Gradually, Luna began to doubt herself. Maybe her lighthouse was too sensitive. Maybe all those subtle signals it picked up weren't really important. Maybe she was making navigation more complicated than it needed to be. She started apologizing to the boats that came seeking help, saying things like, "Sorry, I know my lighthouse is probably giving you more information than you need," or "I'm sorry if the signals seem excessive." She even began trying to modify her lighthouse to be more like the newer ones. She installed filters to dim its responsiveness, dampeners to reduce its range of detection, shields to block out the subtle signals that the authorities deemed unnecessary. But something strange happened when she did this. Boats that had never had trouble before began running into problems. The fishing crews started coming back with stories of unexpected emotional storms that had caught them off guard, of conflicts that had escalated without warning, of a sense that they were navigating alone in ways they had never felt before. One particularly stormy night, a small boat sent out a distress call that was so quiet, so filled with shame and hesitation, that the newer lighthouses didn't detect it at all. It was a young fisherman who had gotten turned around not just geographically but emotionally. He was lost in feelings of inadequacy and fear, convinced that his need for help was a sign of weakness. The newer lighthouses, designed to respond, only to clear obvious emergencies missed his subtle call entirely. But Luna's lighthouse, even with all the modifications she'd made to dim its sensitivity, still caught the faint signal. Something in her heart recognized the particular frequency of someone apologizing for needing help, someone trying to make themselves smaller so as not to be a burden. She realized in that moment that her lighthouse's sensitivity wasn't a flaw. It was designed to pick up on exactly these kinds of calls, the ones that came wrapped in shame and whispered rather than shouted. Luna made a decision that night. She removed all the filters, all the dampeners, all the modifications she'd made to try to make her lighthouse more like the others. She let her lighthouse pulse with its full range of sensitivity, its complete spectrum of awareness. And as she did, she felt something in her own heart lighten, a relief at no longer having to apologize for the very thing that made her lighthouse uniquely valuable. The next morning, the young fisherman found his way safely to shore. When he thanked Luna, he said something that stayed with her. "I was so ashamed to call for help because I thought I was being too sensitive about my situation. But your lighthouse made me feel like maybe my feelings were valid, like maybe needing help didn't make me weak. It was the first time I felt like my sensitivity was understood rather than judged." Luna realized then that her lighthouse didn't just guide boats through physical waters, it guided them through emotional waters too. It helped people navigate the shame they felt about their own sensitivity, the apologies they'd learned to make for their feelings, the ways they'd learned to dim their own light to make others more comfortable. From that day forward, Luna stopped apologizing for her lighthouse's sensitivity. She understood that in a world full of lighthouses designed to respond only to obvious emergencies, there needed to be lighthouses that could detect the subtle calls for help, the quiet distress signals, the barely whispered needs that others missed. Her lighthouse wasn't too sensitive. It was sensitive in exactly the right way for exactly the right purpose. And she began to understand that the same was true for her own heart. Her ability to sense the subtle emotional currents around her, to feel deeply what others might miss, to respond to beauty and pain with equal intensity, these weren't flaws to be fixed, but gifts to be honored. Like her lighthouse, her sensitivity served a purpose that went beyond her own experience. It helped others feel less alone in their own sensitivity, less ashamed of their own deep feelings, less apologetic about their own tender hearts. The story of Luna's lighthouse is your story too. Your sensitivity isn't too much, it's exactly what the world needs. Your ability to feel deeply, to notice what others miss, to respond with genuine emotion to the full spectrum of human experience. These are the very qualities that help others navigate their own emotional waters with less shame and more self-acceptance. You are not a lighthouse that needs to be dimmed. You are a lighthouse that needs to shine at full brightness, guiding others home to their own sensitivity, their own depth, their own beautiful capacity to feel fully and love deeply. Deep beneath the surface of apologizing for your sensitivity lies a belief so fundamental that it shapes how you move through the world, often without your conscious awareness. This first core belief whispers, "If I show my true feelings, I'll be rejected or abandoned." It's a belief born not from weakness but from wisdom. The wisdom of a sensitive heart that learned early how to survive in a world that didn't always know how to hold its depth. This belief might manifest in your life in ways both obvious and subtle. Perhaps you find yourself editing your emotional responses before sharing them, running them through an internal filter that asks, is this too much? Will this make people uncomfortable? Should I tone this down? You might notice yourself saying things like, "I'm probably overreacting, but," or "I know I'm being too sensitive, but," those little disclaimers that attempt to make your feelings more palatable, more acceptable, less threatening to others. Maybe you've experienced the particular pain of sharing something that moved you deeply. A piece of music, a passage, in a book, a moment of natural beauty, only to be met with blank stares or dismissive comments. In that moment, something in you learned that your emotional responses might be too intense for others to understand or appreciate. The belief began to form: my feelings are too much for people to handle. This belief often has its roots in early experiences where your natural emotional expression was met with discomfort, criticism, or withdrawal from others. Perhaps you were a child who cried easily, who felt things deeply, who needed comfort when overwhelmed. Maybe you encountered adults who were uncomfortable with intense emotions, who responded to your tears with phrases like, "Stop being so dramatic," or "You're too sensitive for your own good." These weren't necessarily cruel people. They may have been operating from their own learned discomfort with emotional intensity. Or perhaps your sensitivity was met with well-meaning but misguided attempts to toughen you up. Adults who cared about you may have believed that helping you become less sensitive would protect you from a harsh world. They might have said things like, "You need to develop thicker skin," or "The world isn't going to coddle your feelings." While their intention was protective, the message you received was that your natural way of being was somehow inadequate for the world you'd need to navigate. Sometimes this belief forms not from direct criticism of your emotions, but from witnessing how others responded to emotional expression in general. Maybe you grew up in a family where feelings were seen as inconvenient or disruptive to daily functioning. You learned to read the room, to sense when emotional expression would be welcome and when it would create tension. Over time, you developed an exquisite sensitivity not just to your own emotions, but to others' capacity to handle those emotions. The protective logic of this belief is actually quite brilliant. If showing your true feelings leads to rejection, then managing, minimizing, or apologizing for those feelings becomes a strategy for maintaining connection. Your sensitive heart learned to package itself in ways that felt safer for others to receive. You became skilled at emotional translation, taking your intense feelings and rendering them in more socially acceptable forms. But here's what this belief costs you. It requires you to maintain a constant internal editing process that is exhausting and alienating. You begin to lose touch with your authentic emotional responses because you're so focused on managing how those responses will be received. You start to question whether your feelings are valid, whether your responses are appropriate, whether your emotional reality can be trusted. This belief also creates a painful paradox. The very quality that makes you most capable of deep, authentic connection, your emotional sensitivity, becomes the quality you feel you must hide to maintain connection. You end up feeling lonely even in relationships because the people who care about you are relating to a carefully managed version of who you are, not the full depth of your emotional reality. What's particularly heartbreaking about this belief is how it can become self-fulfilling. When you're constantly apologizing for your feelings, when you're treating your emotional responses as burdens that others must tolerate, you inadvertently teach others to see your sensitivity as problematic too. The very thing you're trying to prevent, rejection of your emotional nature, becomes more likely because you're presenting your emotions as something that should be rejected. But tonight, I want to offer you a different possibility. What if this belief, while understandable and protective, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding? What if the problem isn't that your feelings are too much, but that you've been in relationships and environments that were too little in their capacity to hold emotional depth? What if your sensitivity isn't something that threatens connection, but something that creates the possibility for deeper, more authentic connection than most people have ever experienced? Consider this. The people who are threatened by your emotional depth are often people who are disconnected from their own emotional depth. Your sensitivity doesn't actually threaten them. It reminds them of something they've lost or never learned to access in themselves. Your tears, your joy, your capacity to be moved by beauty, these aren't threats to relationship, they're invitations to more authentic relating. The truth this belief has been protecting you from is not that your feelings are too much, but that not everyone is capable of holding space for emotional authenticity. This isn't a failing on your part, it's information about compatibility, about who can meet you in the depths and who can only relate to you on the surface. Your sensitivity isn't the problem that needs to be fixed, it's the gift that helps. You identify who can truly see and appreciate you for who you are. When you stop apologizing for your feelings, something beautiful happens. You give others permission to stop apologizing for theirs too. Your willingness to feel fully and openly becomes a form of leadership, showing others that it's safe to be authentic, that emotional depth is not only acceptable, but valuable. You become a person that others trust with their own feelings because they sense that you won't judge or minimize their emotional experience. This first belief, that showing your true feelings leads to rejection, has been trying to protect your tender heart from pain, but in doing so, it has also protected you from the deep joy and connection that come from being fully known and loved for who you really are. Tonight, we begin to thank this belief for its protective service while gently questioning whether it's still serving your highest good. Building on that first belief, a second layer of protection has formed in your psyche. My emotions are too intense and overwhelming for others. This belief goes beyond worrying about rejection. It carries the weight of feeling responsible for others' emotional comfort, of believing that your natural intensity is somehow harmful to those around you. This belief might show up in your relationships as a constant monitoring of others' reactions to your emotional expressions. You've become skilled at reading micro-expressions, at sensing when someone is becoming uncomfortable with your tears, your excitement, your anger, or your joy. You've learned to recognize that particular look in someone's eyes that says, "This is more emotion than I know how to handle," and you've developed reflexes to immediately dial down your expression, to apologize, to make yourself smaller. Maybe you've had the experience of sharing exciting news with someone only to notice them taking a small step back, their energy shifting in a way that signals your enthusiasm is too much. Or perhaps you've been in moments of grief or disappointment where your tears seem to create anxiety in others, where your sadness felt too large for the space you were in. These experiences layer upon each other, creating a narrative that your emotional intensity is a force that overwhelms and burdens others. This belief often carries a particular kind of shame, not just the shame of feeling rejected, but the shame of believing you've harmed others with your emotional presence. You might find yourself thinking, "I made them uncomfortable with my crying," or "My excitement was too much for them to handle," or "I overwhelmed them with my needs." This creates a double burden. Not only do you feel the original emotion, but you also feel guilty about having felt it in the first place. The origins of this belief often trace back to experiences where your emotional intensity coincided with others' distress. Perhaps you were a child whose tears triggered anxiety in a parent who didn't know how to comfort you. Maybe your joy and excitement felt too big for spaces that needed to be quiet and contained. You might have been the family member whose emotional responses seemed to create chaos or tension in your household. Sometimes this belief forms from being the person others turn to with their own emotional struggles. If you were the one who listened to everyone's problems, who absorbed others' pain, who provided emotional support to friends and family, you might have learned that your own emotional intensity felt selfish or burdensome in comparison. You began to see your role as the emotional caretaker, the one who holds space for others' feelings while minimizing your own. This belief can also develop from witnessing how your emotional intensity affected specific people you cared about. Maybe you had a parent or partner who seemed to shut down when faced with strong emotions, who would withdraw or become distant when you were upset. You learned to associate your emotional expression with the loss of connection, with others pulling away to protect themselves from what felt like too much intensity. The protective function of this belief is profound. If your emotions overwhelm others, then learning to contain them, to make them smaller, to process them privately, becomes a way of caring for the people you love. You develop what I call emotional self-containment, the ability to experience intense feelings while presenting a manageable exterior to the world. This skill has probably served you well in many contexts, allowing you to function in work environments, social situations, and relationships where emotional intensity might not be welcome. But this belief exacts a significant cost. It requires you to live in a state of constant emotional self-monitoring, always assessing whether your feelings are too much for the current context. You begin to experience your own emotions as potentially dangerous, as forces that need to be carefully
managed rather than naturally expressed.
This creates an internal split where you're both the person feeling the emotion and the person policing that emotion. This belief also robs others of the opportunity to grow in their capacity to hold space for emotional intensity. When you constantly manage your emotions to make others comfortable, you inadvertently enable their avoidance of emotional depth. You become complicit in maintaining relationships that can only function on an emotionally superficial level, because you're doing all the work of keeping things manageable. Perhaps most painfully, this belief can lead you to avoid situations where you might feel intensely. You might find yourself staying away from movies that could make you cry, avoiding conversations that could trigger strong feelings, or distancing yourself from experiences that could evoke joy or excitement. You begin to live a dampened version of your life, not because you don't want to feel, but because you're trying to protect others from your feelings. The truth that this belief obscures is this: your emotional intensity is not a force that harms others. It's a force that invites others into deeper authenticity. When you feel deeply and express that feeling honestly, you create permission for others to access their own emotional depth. Your tears can help others connect with their own grief. Your joy can awaken dormant happiness in others. Your anger can help others recognize their own boundaries. Yes, some people may feel overwhelmed by your emotional intensity, but this is information about their current capacity, not a judgment about your worth or appropriateness. Just as you wouldn't dim a beautiful sunset because some people find it too bright, you don't need to dim your emotional radiance because some people find it too intense. Consider the people in your life who have been most meaningful to you, who have contributed most to your growth and healing. Chances are these were people who weren't afraid of emotional intensity, who could meet you in the depths without becoming overwhelmed. These relationships show you what becomes possible when you're with people who can hold space for your full emotional range. This belief has been trying to protect you from the pain of overwhelming others, from the guilt of being too much. But in its well-intentioned protection, it has also shielded you from the profound connections that become possible when two people can meet each other in authentic emotional intensity. Has kept you from discovering that your capacity to feel deeply is not a burden you place on others, but a gift you offer to a world that desperately needs more emotional authenticity. Your emotions are not too intense. They are appropriately intense for someone who is fully alive, fully present, fully engaged with the beautiful and painful complexity of human existence. The world doesn't need you to feel less. It needs more people who have the courage to feel as deeply and authentically as you do. At the deepest layer of your relationship with sensitivity lies perhaps the most complex belief of all. I must earn the right to have feelings by being useful or perfect. This belief represents the ultimate attempt to make your emotional nature acceptable by proving your worth through service, achievement, or flawless behavior. It's a belief that says your feelings are a luxury that must be paid for, a privilege that must be earned, rather than a birthright that simply comes with being human. This belief might manifest in your life as a relentless drive to be helpful, to anticipate others' needs, to solve problems before they're even fully articulated. You might find yourself saying yes to requests even when you're exhausted, taking on responsibilities that aren't truly yours, or going above and beyond in your work, relationships, and commitments. The underlying logic is subtle but powerful. If I'm useful enough, valuable enough, indispensable enough, then maybe my emotional needs will be acceptable too. Perhaps you recognize the pattern of postponing your own emotional processing until after you've taken care of everyone else's needs. You might think, yeah, I can't deal with my own feelings right now because so-and-so needs my help. Or, I don't
have time to be upset because there's too much that needs to be done.
Your emotions become something you'll get to later, after you've earned the right to feel them through your service to others. This belief often shows up as perfectionism around emotional expression itself. You might find yourself thinking that you can only share your feelings if you can articulate them perfectly, if you're absolutely certain they're valid, if you can present them in a way that won't inconvenience anyone. You develop impossibly high standards for your own emotional experience, believing that messy, complicated, or unclear feelings are somehow unacceptable. The origins of this belief are often rooted in early experiences where love and acceptance were conditional on your behavior, your usefulness, or your ability to make others' lives easier. Perhaps you were praised for being the easy child, for not causing problems, for being helpful and considerate. While these qualities are genuinely valuable, if they became the primary way you received love and attention, you might have internalized the message that your worth was tied to your utility rather than your inherent value as a person. Sometimes this belief develops in families where there was significant stress, trauma, or dysfunction. If you were a child in a household where resources, whether emotional, financial, or otherwise, felt scarce, you might have learned that your needs were less important than keeping the family system stable. You became the child who didn't add to the burden, who helped solve problems rather than creating them, who earned your place in the family through your helpfulness and emotional self-sufficiency. This belief can also form in response to having a parent or caregiver who was emotionally unavailable or overwhelmed. If expressing your feelings led to that person becoming more stressed or distant, you learned to earn their emotional availability by being perfect, helpful, or problem-free. Your feelings became something you could only share if you had paid for that privilege through good behavior or usefulness. In romantic relationships, this belief might show up as the conviction that you need to be the perfect partner, always supportive, never needy, emotionally available for your partner, while requiring minimal emotional support in return. You might find yourself thinking that your relationship problems are your fault because you're being too emotional or too demanding, and that if you could just be better, more giving, more patient, then your emotional needs would be more acceptable. In work environments, this belief can drive you to overfunction, to take on more than your share of emotional labor, to be the person everyone comes to with their problems while never bringing your own struggles to work. You earn the right to occasionally have a bad day by being exceptionally productive, positive, and helpful on all the other days. The protective logic of this belief is both understandable and heartbreaking. If having feelings is risky, then earning the right to those feelings through usefulness or perfection creates a sense of safety and control. It provides a framework for making your emotional nature acceptable within systems that might otherwise reject it. You become indispensable, and indispensable people get to have feelings. or so the logic goes. But this belief creates an exhausting cycle where your emotional needs are always contingent, always earned rather than inherent. You live in a constant state of proving yourself worthy of basic human experiences like sadness, anger, fear, or even joy. Your feelings become transactional, something you pay for with your service, your perfection, your self-sacrifice. This belief also sets up an impossible standard. No amount of usefulness or perfection is ever quite enough to fully secure your right to have feelings. There's always more you could do, some way you could be better, some additional service you could provide. The goalposts keep moving because the fundamental premise is flawed. The idea that feelings are privileges to be earned rather than aspects of human nature to be honored. Perhaps most tragically, this belief keeps you from discovering that you are worthy of love, support, and emotional space simply because you exist. Your feelings don't need to be justified, earned, or paid for. They are part of your birthright as a human being, as valid and important as anyone else's feelings, regardless of how useful you are or how perfectly you behave. The people who truly love you don't love you because of what you do for them, how perfect you are, or how little emotional space you take up. They love you because of who you are, including your messy, complicated, intense feelings. They want to know about your struggles, not because you've earned the right to share them, but because they care about your well-being and want to be present with you in both joy and difficulty. This belief has been protecting you from the fear that your emotional nature is unacceptable unless you compensate for it somehow. But in doing so, it has also protected you from the profound relief and freedom that come from being loved unconditionally, from having your feelings welcomed simply because they're yours, from discovering that your worth is not something you need to earn, but something you already possess. Your feelings are not a luxury that requires payment through service or perfection. They are not a burden that you must justify or apologize for. They are an integral part of who you are, and they deserve to be honored, witnessed, and held with care. Not because you've earned that care, but because you are inherently worthy of it. Tonight, we begin to explore what it might feel like to have feelings without earning them, to be emotional without justifying it, to take up space with your inner life, not because you've paid for that space through your usefulness, but because that space belongs to you by right of being beautifully, sensitively, perfectly human. Section 3, complete, 4,500 words. This section explores the 3 deepest beliefs that drive sensitivity: shame, fear of rejection for authentic feeling, belief that emotions are too intense for others, and the conviction that feelings must be earned through perfection or usefulness. Each belief is explored with compassion, understanding its protective function, while gently introducing the possibility of a different relationship with sensitivity. The first phase of healing your relationship with sensitivity is the gentle art
of recognition, learning to witness your patterns without immediately trying to change them. This isn't about becoming hyper-aware of every emotional response or analyzing yourself constantly.
Rather, it's about developing a kind, curious awareness of how you currently relate to your own sensitivity. Recognition begins with noticing the small moments throughout your day when you automatically apologize for your feelings. Maybe it's that instant "I'm sorry" that follows your tears. Or the way you preface sharing something that moved you with, "I know this is silly, but..." These aren't character flaws to be fixed. They're simply learned responses that your system developed to stay safe in a world that often misunderstood your sensitivity. Start by noticing without trying to stop these responses. When you catch yourself saying, "Sorry, I'm being too sensitive," simply take note. There's that protective response again. There's no need to judge yourself for having the response or to immediately try to change it. Recognition is about developing a friendly, curious relationship with your own patterns. You might also notice the physical sensations that accompany your emotional responses. Does your chest tighten when you're about to cry in front of someone? Do your shoulders hunch when you're preparing to share something that matters to you? Does your breathing become shallow when you sense others' emotions shifting? These bodily responses are your nervous system's way of trying to protect your tender heart from perceived danger. Pay attention to the environments and relationships where you feel most compelled to apologize for your sensitivity. Is it at work, where emotional expression feels risky? With certain family members who have always viewed your feelings as excessive? In social situations where you worry about being too much? This information isn't ammunition for self-criticism. It's valuable data about where your protective systems feel most activated. Notice, too, the moments when you don't apologize for your feelings, those rare instances when you allow yourself to cry without explanation, to express joy without apology, to share your emotional response without disclaimer. What's different about these moments? Are you with certain people who make you feel safer? Are you in specific environments that feel more accepting? Understanding when you naturally feel permission to be authentic can help you identify what conditions support your healing. The recognition phase also involves noticing the stories you tell yourself about your sensitivity. Listen to your internal dialogue when you're feeling emotional. Do you hear voices saying things like, "You're overreacting," or "No one wants to deal with this," or "You need to get it together"? These internal voices often echo messages you received from others throughout your life, and recognizing them is the first step to developing a more compassionate inner voice. Sometimes recognition involves noticing the absence of feeling, those times when you've become so skilled at managing your emotions that you've lost touch with them entirely. If you find yourself feeling emotionally numb or disconnected, this too is information. Your system may have become so efficient at protecting you from emotional overwhelm that it's protecting you from feeling at all. As you practice recognition, you might discover that your sensitivity shows up differently in different contexts. Maybe you're comfortable with your emotional responses in private, but struggle with them in public. Perhaps you're fine with your own sadness, but feel ashamed of your joy or excitement. There's no right or wrong way to be sensitive. Your unique patterns are simply your unique patterns, worthy of understanding rather than judgment. The goal of recognition isn't to become perfectly aware of every emotional response, but rather to develop a baseline of gentle self-awareness. You're building what therapists call observer self, the part of you that can witness your experience with kindness and curiosity, rather than criticism and shame. This phase of healing is like becoming a gentle scientist of your own emotional life. You're gathering data, noticing patterns, developing hypotheses about how your sensitivity shows up in different contexts. But unlike harsh self-analysis, this scientific approach is infused with compassion and acceptance. You're not studying yourself to find what's wrong, but to understand what's true. Remember that recognition is an ongoing practice, not a destination. Even as you move into deeper phases of healing, you'll continue to discover new layers of how your sensitivity operates in your life. Each moment of recognition is a small act of self-compassion, a gentle step toward a more accepting relationship with your emotional nature. As you settle into this practice of recognition, allow yourself to be surprised by what you discover. Your sensitivity may be more nuanced, more intelligent, more purposeful than you ever realized. The patterns you've been judging as problematic may reveal themselves to be sophisticated, protective mechanisms that have served you well. Recognition is the foundation of all healing, the gentle beginning of coming home to yourself exactly as you are. Once you've begun to recognize your patterns around sensitivity, the next phase of healing involves meeting those protective parts of yourself with genuine compassion. This is perhaps the most transformative aspect of healing shame around sensitivity, learning to befriend the internal mechanisms that have been trying to keep you safe, rather than fighting against them or trying to eliminate them. Think of the part of you that automatically apologizes for your tears as a loving guardian who learned early that emotions could feel dangerous in certain contexts. This part developed strategies to help you navigate a world that often didn't know how to hold space for emotional intensity. Rather than seeing this part as weak or problematic, you can begin to appreciate the intelligence and care that went into developing these protective responses. When you notice yourself beginning to apologize for your feelings, try pausing and speaking internally to that protective part with genuine appreciation. Thank you for trying to keep me safe. Thank you for working so hard to help me belong and be accepted. I understand that you learned to do this because it felt necessary. This isn't about stopping the protective response immediately, but about developing a relationship with it based on understanding rather than resistance. You might discover that different protective parts of you have different concerns and strategies. The part that monitors others' reactions to your emotions might be different from the part that tries to earn the right to have feelings through perfection. Each part developed in response to specific experiences and carries its own wisdom about how to navigate the world as a sensitive person. Some protective parts might feel young and vulnerable, perhaps carrying the memory of being a child whose emotional needs felt too big for the adults around you. Other parts might feel more mature and strategic, having developed sophisticated ways of managing your emotional expression in professional or social contexts. All of these parts deserve to be met with understanding and appreciation for their efforts to help you survive and thrive. This compassion meeting isn't about convincing your protective parts to relax or go away. Instead, it's about developing an internal dialogue based on mutual respect and collaboration. You might say to a protective part, "I understand why you learned to do this, and I'm grateful for your care. I wonder if we might explore some other options together, ways of staying safe while also honoring our sensitivity." Sometimes protective parts are hesitant to relax their vigilance because they're afraid that if they stop protecting you, you'll be hurt again. These parts need reassurance that you're not asking them to abandon their protective role, but rather to work with you in developing strategies that honor both your need for safety and your need for authenticity. You can practice this compassion, meeting in real time as protective responses arise. When you catch yourself editing your emotional response before sharing it, you might pause and internally acknowledge, "I notice the part of me that wants to make sure this is okay for the other person. I appreciate this part's concern for maintaining connection." This acknowledgement often creates space for more choice about how you want to respond. The practice of meeting your protective parts with compassion extends to your relationship with your sensitivity itself. Instead of seeing your emotional intensity as something to be managed or controlled, you can begin to appreciate it as a gift that comes with its own built-in wisdom. Your tears aren't just leaks in your emotional armor. They're your heart's way of honoring beauty, grief, and the full spectrum of human experience. Your tendency to absorb others' emotions isn't just poor boundaries, it's evidence of your profound capacity for empathy and connection. Your need for quieter, gentler environments isn't weakness. It's your nervous system's wisdom about what conditions support your thriving. Each aspect of your sensitivity can be met with this kind of appreciative understanding. This compassion meeting also involves recognizing the gifts that your protective parts have given you. Your sensitivity to others' emotional states has probably made you an exceptional friend, a caring partner, a supportive colleague. Your awareness of your own emotional impact on others has likely made you considerate and thoughtful in your relationships. These aren't consolation prizes for being too sensitive. They're genuine strengths that emerge from your particular way of being in the world. As you practice meeting your protective parts with compassion, you might notice that they begin to relax slightly. Not because you've convinced them to let go of their protective role, but because they feel seen and appreciated for their efforts. When our protective parts feel understood rather than criticized, they're often more willing to collaborate with us in finding ways of being that honor both safety and authenticity. This phase of healing also involves extending compassion to yourself. For having needed these protective strategies in the first place, there's often a layer of shame around having had to develop defenses around your sensitivity, as if needing protection means there's something wrong with you. But needing protection is simply evidence that you're a sensitive being living in a world that doesn't always understand sensitivity. It's not a failing, it's a reasonable response to challenging circumstances. You might also practice extending compassion to the people in your life who have struggled to understand or support your sensitivity. Often, these individuals weren't trying to hurt you. They were operating from their own limitations, their own discomfort with emotional intensity, their own learned patterns around feeling. This compassion isn't about excusing harmful behavior, but about freeing yourself from the burden of needing others to be different than they are. As you develop this compassionate relationship with your protective parts, you create the internal safety that allows for authentic emotional expression. When your sensitive heart knows that it will be met with understanding rather than criticism, even from your own internal voice, it becomes more willing to emerge from its protective hiding places. This compassion meeting is an ongoing practice, rather than a one-time event. Different protective parts may emerge in different contexts, and each one deserves to be met with the same gentle understanding. Over time, this practice transforms your relationship not just with your sensitivity, but with all aspects of yourself that have felt vulnerable or in need of protection. The beautiful paradox of this work is that as you befriend your protective parts rather than fighting them, they naturally begin to soften their grip. Not because you've forced them to change, but because they feel safe enough to explore new ways of protecting you, ways that honor both your need for emotional safety and your authentic sensitivity. With recognition established and compassion flowing toward your protective parts, you're ready to begin the delicate process of integration, taking small, gentle steps toward a new relationship with your sensitivity. Integration isn't about dramatic transformation or sudden change. Instead, it's about creating tiny shifts that honor both your need for safety and your desire for authentic emotional expression. The key to successful integration is starting so small that your protective parts don't feel threatened by the changes you're making. If your system is used to apologizing for tears, integration might begin with simply noticing the impulse to apologize without immediately acting on it. You're not forcing yourself to stop apologizing. You're simply creating a moment of choice between the impulse and the action. Perhaps integration begins with choosing one safe relationship where you practice sharing your emotional responses without disclaimers. This might be with a trusted friend who has shown consistent acceptance of your sensitivity, or in your private journal where no one else will see your words. The goal isn't to expose yourself in risky contexts, but to practice authentic expression in the safest possible environment. You might experiment with what I call emotional truth-telling in small doses. Instead of sharing the full intensity of an emotional response that might feel overwhelming to others or to yourself, you practice sharing pieces of your truth. That movie really moved me. Instead of apologizing for your tears, I'm feeling pretty overwhelmed by the news lately. Instead of minimizing your response to world events. Integration also involves paying attention to your body's wisdom about emotional expression. Before sharing a feeling, you might pause and check in with your nervous system. Does your body feel open and grounded or tight and defensive? This isn't about only sharing when you feel completely calm. It's about developing awareness of your internal state so you can make conscious choices about when and how to be emotionally authentic. Sometimes integration looks like advocating for your sensitive needs in small, gentle ways. Maybe it's asking to sit in a quieter section of a restaurant, or requesting that the music be turned down during a gathering at your home. These aren't demands that others accommodate your excessive sensitivity. They're reasonable requests for environmental conditions that support your well-being. The practice of integration often involves reframing your understanding of emotional boundaries. Instead of seeing boundaries as walls that keep your emotions contained, you can begin to see them as flexible membranes that allow for authentic expression while maintaining your sense of safety. Good boundaries don't make you less sensitive. They create the conditions where your sensitivity can be expressed more freely. You might also practice what therapists call emotional granularity, developing more nuanced language for your emotional experiences. Instead of simply saying you're too sensitive, you might explore whether you're feeling overwhelmed, overstimulated, emotionally saturated, or empathically flooded. This precise language helps both you and others understand what's actually happening, making it easier to find appropriate support or solutions. Integration includes learning to tolerate the discomfort that sometimes comes with authentic emotional expression. When you share a feeling without apologizing for it, you might notice anxiety, guilt, or fear arising. These uncomfortable sensations don't mean you're doing something wrong. They're often signs that you're doing something new, something that challenges old patterns of emotional hiding. Part of integration involves developing what I call emotional stamina, the capacity to stay present with your feelings even when they're intense. This doesn't mean overwhelming yourself with emotion, but rather building your ability to remain connected to your sensitive heart even when it's activated. Like physical stamina, emotional stamina develops gradually through practice. You might experiment with different ways of expressing the same emotion, discovering which approaches feel most authentic and sustainable for you. Some days, your grief might need to be expressed through tears and words. Other days, it might need to be channeled through music, movement, or creative expression. Integration is about developing a diverse toolkit for honoring your emotional life. This phase of healing also involves celebrating small victories in your relationship with sensitivity. Maybe you shared an emotional response without apologizing, or you asked for what you needed in a challenging situation, or you simply noticed your protective patterns without judging them. These moments of growth deserve recognition and appreciation. Integration often includes renegotiating relationships based on your evolving relationship with your sensitivity. Some people in your life may welcome your increased emotional authenticity, while others may feel uncomfortable with the changes. This isn't necessarily about ending relationships, but rather about adjusting your expectations and interactions based on others' capacity to meet you in your sensitivity. You might also need to integrate new ways of caring for yourself as a sensitive person. This could include developing daily practices that support your nervous system, creating environments that feel nurturing to your emotional nature, or establishing routines that help you process the emotional input you naturally absorb from the world around you. The integration process is rarely linear. You might find yourself moving forward in some areas while old patterns persist in others. You might have days when you feel confident in your sensitivity and other days when the old shame resurfaces. This isn't failure. It's the natural rhythm of healing, the way growth actually happens in real life. As you practice integration, pay attention to the feedback you receive from your own system. Do you feel more energy when you express yourself authentically? Do you sleep better when you've honored your emotional responses during the day? Does your creativity flow more freely when you're not constantly managing your sensitivity? Your body and psyche will give you information about which changes are truly serving your well-being. Remember that integration is not about becoming someone else or fundamentally changing your sensitive nature. It's about becoming more fully yourself. Expressing your sensitivity with less shame, more choice, and greater self-compassion. It's about discovering what becomes possible when you stop apologizing for the very quality that makes you most beautifully human. The gentle steps you take in this phase of healing create the foundation for the deeper integration work that follows. Each small act of authentic expression, each moment of self-compassion, each choice to honor rather than apologize for your sensitivity builds your capacity for the richer, more connected way of being that your sensitive heart has always longed for. Your sensitivity isn't just an emotional or psychological experience. It lives in your body, in your nervous system, in the very fibers of your being. Healing your relationship with sensitivity requires attending not just to your thoughts and beliefs, but to the somatic wisdom that has been trying to protect and support your sensitive nature all along. Your nervous system, that intricate network of responses that governs how you interact with the world, has become exquisitely attuned to emotional information. While others might process emotions primarily in their minds, you process them through your entire being, feeling them in your chest, your stomach, your shoulders, your breath. This full-body emotional processing is not a malfunction. It's a feature of how your particular nervous system is designed to navigate the world. Understanding your nervous system's responses to emotional intensity is crucial for developing a sustainable relationship with your sensitivity. When you encounter strong emotions, whether your own or others, your autonomic nervous system may shift into what Dr. Stephen Porges calls different states of activation. Sometimes you might feel energized and capable of handling the emotional input. Other times you might feel overwhelmed, scattered, or compelled to withdraw. Neither response is wrong. They're simply different ways your system attempts to manage emotional information. Learning to work with your nervous system, rather than against it, becomes essential for honoring your sensitivity without becoming overwhelmed by it. This might mean developing practices that help you stay present with emotional intensity without becoming flooded by it. One of the most fundamental practices is conscious breathing. Not the kind of breathing that tries to make emotions go away, but breathing that helps you stay connected to your body while you feel. Try this gentle practice. When you notice an emotional response arising, place one hand on your chest and one on your belly. Instead of trying to change your breathing, simply notice how emotion affects your breath. Does it become shallow? Does it speed up? Does it feel tight or restricted? There's no need to fix anything. Simply notice how your sensitive system responds to feeling. Your body holds tremendous wisdom about what kinds of environments and interactions support your sensitive nature. You might notice that certain lighting, sounds, textures, or energy levels either support or overwhelm your system. This isn't pickiness or high maintenance. This is your nervous system giving you important information about what conditions allow your sensitivity to flourish rather than become burdensome. Creating what I call nervous system sanctuaries becomes an important part of integrating your sensitivity. These are spaces, practices, or rituals that help your system return to a state of calm alertness, what therapists call the window
of tolerance. This might be a corner of your home with soft lighting and comfortable textures, a daily practice of gentle movement or stretching, or simply 5 minutes of quiet time where you're not processing anyone else's emotional energy.
Your body also holds memories of times when your sensitivity was met with understanding and acceptance, as well as times when it was criticized or rejected. These embodied memories can be activated by current situations, causing you to have responses that seem disproportionate to what's actually happening. When you find yourself feeling shame about an emotional response, it's often because your body is remembering earlier times when similar responses led to rejection or criticism. Healing these embodied memories doesn't require reliving traumatic experiences or analyzing every detail of your past. Instead, it involves creating new experiences in your body, experiences of safety while feeling, of acceptance while being emotional, of connection while being authentically sensitive. Each time you express a feeling without apologizing, each moment you stay present with emotion without judgment, you're creating new neural pathways that support your sensitivity. The practice of body-based healing also involves learning to distinguish between your emotions and others' emotions within your own system. As a sensitive person, you likely absorb emotional information from your environment in ways that others don't. While this capacity for emotional attunement is a gift, it can become overwhelming if you don't develop skills for managing the emotional input you receive. One helpful practice is what I call emotional inventory. Taking a moment to check in with your body and ask, which of these feelings are mine, and which might I be picking up from others? This isn't about becoming less empathetic, but about developing clarity around whose emotional experience you're actually having. When you can distinguish between your own emotions and the emotional environment around you, you can respond more consciously to both. Your body also needs practices that help it discharge the emotional energy it absorbs throughout the day. For some sensitive people, this might be physical movement that helps emotions flow through, rather than getting stuck. For others, it might be creative expression, time in nature, or practices that engage the senses in soothing ways. The key is finding what helps your particular system process and release emotional input without becoming overwhelmed by it. Breathing practices specifically designed for sensitive nervous systems can be particularly helpful. Unlike breathing techniques that try to calm you down or make emotions go away, these practices help you stay present and grounded while experiencing emotional intensity. One simple practice is to imagine breathing into your heart space, creating room for whatever emotion is present without trying to change it. The healing of sensitivity also involves recognizing that your nervous system may need different support at different times. Sometimes you might need practices that help you feel more grounded and contained. Other times, you might need practices that help you feel more open and expansive. Learning to read your own nervous system's needs and respond accordingly is a crucial skill for living comfortably with sensitivity. Your body's responses to emotional stimuli are also sources of valuable information. The way your chest opens when you feel joy, the way your stomach tightens when you sense conflict, the way your shoulders carry the weight of others' pain. These aren't problems to be solved, but information to be honored. Your body is constantly communicating with you about your emotional environment, and learning to listen to these messages can help you make choices that support your well-being. As you develop a more conscious relationship with your nervous system, you might notice that your capacity for emotional intensity actually increases rather than decreases. This isn't because you're becoming more sensitive, but because you're learning to be with your sensitivity in ways that don't overwhelm your system. When your nervous system feels safe and supported, it can handle more emotional input without going into protective shutdown or overwhelm. The body-based healing of sensitivity is not about becoming less responsive to emotional information, but about becoming more skillful in how you work with that responsiveness. It's about creating the internal conditions where your sensitivity can be a source of wisdom and connection rather than a source of overwhelm and shame. It's about honoring the intelligence of your nervous system while developing practices that support its capacity to navigate an emotionally complex world. Remember that healing happens not just in your mind but in your body, not just through understanding but through experience. Each time you breathe consciously while feeling, each moment you stay present with emotion in your body, Each practice that supports your nervous system's well-being, you're contributing to a more integrated, sustainable relationship with your beautiful sensitivity. As you heal your relationship with sensitivity, the dynamics in your relationships naturally begin to shift. This transformation can be both liberating and challenging, as the people in your life adjust to a version of you who no longer apologizes for feeling deeply, who no longer minimizes emotional responses, who no longer takes responsibility for managing everyone else's comfort with your sensitivity. Some relationships will flourish as you become more authentically yourself. Friends and loved ones who have always appreciated your emotional depth will welcome the opportunity to know you more fully. They may express relief that you're no longer editing yourself, that they can stop worrying about saying or doing something that might trigger your shame, about being too sensitive. These relationships often deepen naturally as you bring more of your authentic self to the connection. However, not all relationships will respond positively to your increased emotional authenticity. Some people in your life have become accustomed to a version of you that manages your sensitivity to make them more comfortable. When you stop doing this emotional labor, they may feel confused, threatened, or even angry. This doesn't necessarily mean these are bad people or that you need to end these relationships, but it does require conscious navigation. The key to managing these relationship shifts is understanding that other people's discomfort with your sensitivity is information about their own relationship with emotions, not evidence that you're doing anything wrong. When someone says you're being too emotional or asks you to tone it down, they're often revealing their own limitations around emotional intensity rather than identifying a problem with your behavior. Setting boundaries around your sensitivity becomes crucial during this phase of healing. This might mean saying things like, "I understand that my crying makes you uncomfortable, but I'm not going to apologize for it anymore," or "I know my excitement feels like a lot to you, but this is how I naturally respond to good news." These boundaries aren't aggressive or defensive. They're clear statements about what you will and won't do to manage others' comfort with your emotional nature. You might also need to have explicit conversations with important people in your life about the changes you're making. This could sound like, "I'm learning to accept my sensitivity as a gift rather than a flaw. And that means I might not apologize for my emotions the way I used to." This isn't about being inconsiderate, it's about being more authentic. Many people, when they understand what you're working toward, can become allies in your healing process. In romantic relationships, this integration can be particularly complex. If your partner has become accustomed to you managing your emotional responses to avoid conflict or discomfort, they may initially resist your increased authenticity. However, many partners discover that they prefer the real you to the managed version. Even if the real you feels more challenging at times, authentic intimacy requires the capacity to meet each other in emotional truth, not in emotional performance. Learning to communicate your needs as a sensitive person becomes essential for healthy relationships. Instead of hoping others will intuitively understand what you need, you can practice being direct about your requirements for emotional safety. This might mean asking for a few minutes to process strong emotions before discussing them, requesting that difficult conversations happen when you're not already overwhelmed, or explaining what kinds of support feel helpful when you're emotionally activated. The integration process also involves recognizing which relationships genuinely support your sensitivity and which ones require you to constantly defend or minimize it. This doesn't mean you can only be close to other highly sensitive people, but it does mean prioritizing relationships with people who can appreciate emotional depth even if they don't experience it themselves. You might discover that some friendships were primarily based on your role as the emotional caretaker, the one who listened to everyone's problems while keeping your own needs small. As you become more authentic about your own emotional needs, these relationships may need to rebalance or may naturally fade. This can feel like loss, but it also creates space for relationships based on mutual care rather than one-sided emotional labor. Family relationships often present unique challenges during this integration process. Family members may have the strongest investment in keeping you in familiar roles, and they may resist changes in how you express or discuss your sensitivity. You might need to develop strategies for staying true to your healing while managing family dynamics that haven't yet evolved to support your growth. In professional contexts, integrating your sensitivity requires particular finesse. While you're learning not to apologize for your emotional nature, you also need to navigate workplace cultures that may not understand or value emotional sensitivity. This might involve finding ways to honor your sensitivity while maintaining professional effectiveness, perhaps by taking breaks when you feel overwhelmed, creating physical environments that support your nervous system, or finding colleagues who appreciate your emotional intelligence. The healing of sensitivity also affects how you handle conflict in relationships. Instead of automatically assuming that any emotional tension is your fault for being too sensitive, you can begin to evaluate conflicts more objectively. Sometimes the problem really is that someone is being dismissive of your feelings. Sometimes the issue is genuine incompatibility around emotional expression. And sometimes conflicts can be resolved through better communication about emotional needs and boundaries. You might also notice that as you stop apologizing for your sensitivity, you become less tolerant of people who consistently dismiss or minimize your emotional experiences. This increased discernment isn't about becoming rigid or demanding, but about developing healthy standards for how you deserve to be treated in relationships. The people who truly love and value you will generally adapt to your increased authenticity, even if there's an adjustment period. They may need time to unlearn their habits of trying to manage your emotions or fix your sensitivity, but relationships based on genuine care can usually evolve to support both people's authentic expression. As your relationships shift to accommodate your healing, you might find that you attract different kinds of people into your life. Individuals who are comfortable with emotional depth, who value authenticity over performance, who see your sensitivity as a strength rather than a liability. These new connections can provide powerful validation that you don't need to apologize for who you are to be loved and accepted. Remember that relationship changes during healing are normal and often necessary. Not every relationship is meant to last forever, and some connections may need to end for your continued growth and well-being. Trust that as you become more authentic, you create space for relationships that can truly support and celebrate all of who you are, including your beautiful, sensitive heart. Integrating your healing relationship with sensitivity into daily life requires developing practical strategies that support your emotional authenticity throughout the ordinary moments
of your day.
This isn't about dramatic lifestyle changes or complete personality overhauls, but about making small, consistent choices that honor your sensitive nature in real-world contexts. Morning practices become particularly important for sensitive people because they set the emotional tone for your entire day. Instead of immediately checking your phone or launching into a busy schedule, you might create a few minutes of gentle transition between sleep and activity. This could be as simple as taking 3 conscious breaths, setting an intention to honor your feelings throughout the day, or doing a brief check-in with your emotional and physical state. Your morning practice might also include what I call sensitivity preparation. Taking a moment to consider what emotional challenges the day might bring and how you want to respond to them. If you know you have a difficult conversation ahead, you can remind yourself that whatever emotions arise are valid and don't require apology. If you're going into a crowded or stimulating environment, you can plan how you'll care for your nervous system throughout the experience. Throughout your day, you can practice micro moments of self-acceptance around your sensitivity. When you feel tears arising in response to something beautiful or sad, instead of immediately trying to stop them or apologize for them, you might pause and think, this is my heart responding authentically to life. When you notice yourself absorbing someone else's emotional state instead of judging yourself for being too empathetic, you might appreciate your capacity for connection while also taking steps to ground yourself. Workplace integration requires particular creativity, as professional environments often don't explicitly support emotional expression. However, you can find ways to honor your sensitivity within professional constraints. This might mean taking brief breaks when you feel overwhelmed, creating a more soothing physical environment at your workspace, or finding trusted colleagues with whom you can be more authentic about your emotional responses to work situations. When you need to cry at work, instead of hiding in the bathroom with shame, you might simply excuse yourself briefly and return without elaborate explanations or apologies. If someone notices you've been emotional, you can practice simple, non-apologetic responses like, I was moved by something, or I needed a moment to process that, rather than, sorry, I'm being way too sensitive. Social situations offer opportunities to practice expressing your sensitivity without apology. When friends are planning activities, you might speak up about your needs rather than silently enduring environments that overwhelm your system. I'd love to join you, but could we choose somewhere a bit quieter? Becomes a statement of self-advocacy rather than a shameful admission of limitation. During conversations, you can practice sharing your emotional responses without disclaimers. Instead of, I know this is silly, but that movie really affected me, you might simply say, that movie really moved me. Instead of, sorry, I'm probably overreacting, but you might begin with, I'm having a strong response to this because the subtle shift from apology to simple acknowledgement can transform how both you and others relate to your emotional expressions. Your daily life integration also involves developing skills for managing the emotional input you naturally absorb from others. This might mean creating rituals for clearing your emotional space after being around people who are struggling, or developing practices that help you distinguish between your emotions and those you've picked up from your environment. Evening. Practices become crucial for processing the emotional experiences of your day. This might involve journaling about moments when you honored your sensitivity and moments when old patterns of apology or shame arose. It could include physical practices that help you discharge any emotional energy you've absorbed, or simply taking time to appreciate yourself for the ways you've grown in your relationship with your sensitivity. You might also develop what I call sensitivity celebrations, taking time to appreciate the gifts your emotional responsiveness brought to your day. Maybe your empathy helped a friend feel understood. Perhaps your sensitivity to beauty allowed you to notice and enjoy something others missed. Possibly your emotional awareness helped you navigate a complex social situation with greater wisdom. These aren't consolation prizes for being too sensitive. They're genuine contributions that your sensitivity makes to your life and the lives of others. Daily life integration also means learning to advocate for your needs without elaborate justifications. When you need to leave a party early because the stimulation is becoming overwhelming, you can say, I'm ready to head home, rather than launching into explanations about being too sensitive for crowds. When you need time to process an emotional conversation, you can say, I need some time to think about this, rather than apologizing for not being able to respond immediately. Technology use becomes an important consideration for sensitive people, as the constant stream of information and emotion available through digital media can be overwhelming. You might develop practices around consuming news and social media that honor your emotional responsiveness while protecting your well-being. This could mean checking news only at certain times of day, curating your social media feeds to include more beauty and positivity, or taking regular breaks from digital input entirely. Your daily choices about environment, activities, and relationships can increasingly reflect your understanding of what supports your sensitive nature. This might mean choosing restaurants with softer lighting and quieter atmospheres, selecting movies and books that nourish rather than overwhelm your emotional system, or prioritizing time in nature where your sensitivity can feel like an asset rather than a liability. The integration of sensitivity into daily life is also about learning to trust your emotional responses as valuable information rather than problems to be managed. When something feels off about a situation, instead of dismissing your response as being too sensitive, you can investigate what your emotional radar is picking up. When you feel moved by beauty, instead of minimizing the response, you can allow it to enrich your experience of life. As you practice these daily applications, you might notice that your relationship with sensitivity becomes more natural and less effortful. What once required conscious intention, not apologizing for tears, sharing emotions without disclaimers, advocating for your needs, gradually becomes more automatic. You're not trying to be different than you are. You're simply being who you are without apology. Remember that daily life integration is a practice, not a perfection. There will be days when old patterns resurface, when you find yourself apologizing for emotions or minimizing your responses. These aren't failures, they're simply opportunities to practice self-compassion and gently redirect toward the more accepting relationship with sensitivity you're cultivating. The goal isn't to never have moments of uncertainty about your emotional responses, but to have a foundation of self-acceptance that you can return to when those moments arise. Daily life becomes a canvas for practicing the revolutionary act of living as a sensitive person without apology, contributing your emotional authenticity to a world that desperately needs more people willing to feel deeply and love openly. As we come to the close of this healing journey together, take a moment to appreciate the profound shift that has occurred not just in your understanding, but in your very relationship with what it means to be a sensitive soul in this world. Tonight, you have traveled from a place of apologizing for your emotional nature to a place of recognizing it as one of your greatest gifts. This transformation, however gentle and gradual, represents a revolutionary act of self-acceptance in a world that too often asks us to be less than who we truly are. You have discovered that your sensitivity is not a design flaw requiring constant apology, but a feature of your humanity that serves purposes far beyond your individual experience. Your ability to feel deeply connects you to the full spectrum of human experience in ways that enrich not only your own life, but the lives of everyone you touch. Your tears, in response to beauty, keep alive the human capacity for wonder. Your absorption of others' emotions demonstrates the kind of empathy that heals communities. Your awareness of subtleties that others miss serves as an early warning system for the groups and relationships you're part of. The three core beliefs we explored together: the fear that authentic feelings lead to rejection, the conviction that your emotions overwhelm others, and the idea that you must earn the right to feel through perfection or usefulness. These beliefs have been working overtime to protect your tender heart from a world that often doesn't understand emotional
depth.
Tonight, you've learned to thank these protective parts while gently questioning whether they still serve your highest good. You've discovered that the problem was never your sensitivity itself, but rather the shame that had grown around it like armor that became too heavy to carry. As you've begun to shed that armor piece by piece, you've rediscovered the truth that your emotional responsiveness is not a burden you place on others, but a gift you offer to a world desperately in need of more authenticity, more depth, more genuine human connection. The healing phases we've traveled together, recognition, compassion, and integration, represent not a linear journey with a clear endpoint, but a spiral path that you'll continue to walk throughout your life. Each time you notice yourself beginning to apologize for a feeling, each moment you choose self-compassion over self-criticism, each instance when you honor your emotional truth without justification, you strengthen your ability to live as an unapologetically sensitive person. Your nervous system, that intricate network of responses that processes emotion through your entire being, has begun to remember what it feels like to be safe while feeling deeply. Your relationships are shifting to accommodate the more authentic version of yourself. And while some adjustments may feel challenging, you're creating space for connections based on genuine understanding rather than emotional performance. In your daily life, you're learning to make choices that honor your sensitive nature, not because you're fragile or high maintenance, but because you're developing the wisdom to create conditions where your sensitivity can flourish rather than overwhelm you. You're becoming skilled at distinguishing between your own emotions and those you absorb from others, at advocating for your needs without elaborate justification, at expressing your feelings without disclaimers or apologies. Perhaps most importantly, you've begun to understand that being sensitive in an often insensitive world is not a personal failing, but a form of leadership. Every time you choose to feel fully rather than numbing out, every moment you respond to beauty with tears of appreciation, every instance when you hold space for someone else's pain without trying to fix it, you model for others what it looks like to be courageously, authentically human. Your sensitivity has always been more than just your personal experience. It's been a bridge between the seen and unseen, the spoken and unspoken, the surface of life and its deeper currents. Tonight, you've reclaimed your role as a bridge builder, understanding that your emotional responsiveness serves not just your own growth, but the healing of our collective disconnection from feeling. The wisdom you've gained on this journey extends far beyond learning to accept your sensitivity. You've discovered that what our culture labels as too much is often exactly enough for a world that has forgotten how to feel. You've learned that your tears are not leaks in your emotional armor, but sacred expressions of your humanity. You've understood that your need for gentler environments and deeper connections is not weakness but wisdom. As you continue forward from this place of greater self-acceptance, remember that healing is not a destination but a way of traveling. There will be moments when old patterns of shame resurface, when you find yourself tempted to apologize for feelings that deserve celebration. In those moments, remember the truth that your sensitivity is not too much. It's exactly what this world needs more of. You are not a lighthouse that needs to be dimmed. You are not an emotion that needs to be apologized for. You are not a feeling that requires justification. You are a beautifully sensitive human being whose capacity to feel deeply is one of the greatest gifts you offer to this world. Tonight, you've come home to that truth. As we prepare to transition into sleep, allow yourself to settle more deeply into the truth of who you are. Not who you've been taught you should be, but who you actually are beneath all the layers of learned shame and protective apologizing. Tonight, you rest as someone who no longer needs to earn the right to feel, who no longer needs to make feelings smaller to make others more comfortable, who no longer needs to apologize for the very quality that makes you most authentically human. Let your body begin to release the tension it has carried from years of emotional vigilance, from constantly monitoring your responses to ensure they weren't too much, too intense, too overwhelming for others. Feel your shoulders soften as they let go of the weight of managing everyone else's comfort with your sensitivity. Notice your chest expanding as it no longer needs to contain emotions that want to flow freely. Your breath can become deeper now, no longer shallow with the anxiety of wondering whether your feelings are appropriate. Each exhale releases another layer of the old story that your sensitivity was somehow wrong. Each inhale draws in the new truth that your emotional responsiveness is a gift, a strength, a beautiful way of being human that needs no justification. Allow your mind to release the constant internal editing that has been exhausting you for so long. You no longer need to run your feelings through filters of appropriateness before expressing them. You no longer need to apologize for crying at beauty, for being moved by music, for caring deeply about things that matter to you. Your emotional responses are valid simply because they're yours. As you settle into rest, appreciate your nervous system for all the ways it has been trying to protect your tender heart. Thank the part of you that learned to monitor others' reactions to your emotions. Thank the part that developed strategies for making your feelings more palatable to others. These parts work so hard to keep you safe, to help you belong, to prevent the pain of rejection. They deserve your gratitude, not your criticism. Feel yourself sinking deeper into the comfort of knowing that you never again have to choose between authenticity and connection. The people who truly deserve space in your life are people who can appreciate your emotional depth, who see your sensitivity as a gift rather than a burden, who would rather know your real feelings than your managed version of those feelings. Your dreams tonight may be different. Dreams where you cry without apology, where you express joy without restraint, where you feel deeply without shame. Let these dreams be a preview of the life that becomes possible when you stop apologizing for the very thing that makes you most beautiful. In your dreams, you might find yourself in conversations where your emotions are welcomed, in relationships where your sensitivity is celebrated, in environments where your emotional truth is honored. Rest in the knowledge that your healing has a ripple effect that extends far beyond your own life. Every time you choose to feel authentically rather than apologetically, you give others permission to do the same. Your courage to be emotionally real in a world that often rewards emotional performance creates space for others to step into their own authenticity. You are not just healing yourself. You are healing the collective wound around emotional expression. Let your body remember what it feels like to be safe while feeling deeply. Your tears are safe here. Your joy is safe here. Your anger, your fear, your excitement, your grief. All of it is safe here. There is no emotion you could feel that would be too much. No response you could have that would require your apology. In this space, in this moment, you are perfectly, completely acceptable exactly as you are. As sleep approaches, imagine yourself surrounded by all the people throughout history who have felt deeply, who have been told they were too sensitive, who have carried the burden of apologizing for their emotional nature. Feel yourself connected to this lineage of sensitive souls, the artists who created beauty from their deep feeling, the healers who used their empathy to serve others, the lovers who brought emotional honesty to their relationships, the dreamers who let their hearts guide them toward what mattered most. You are part of this beautiful tradition of people who refuse to numb out, who insist on feeling fully, who understand that sensitivity is not a liability, but one of humanity's greatest assets. As you join this lineage tonight, you're not just accepting your own sensitivity, you're honoring the sensitivity of everyone who has ever been told they were too much. Your breath is becoming slower now, deeper, more relaxed. With each breath, you're breathing in acceptance of your emotional nature and breathing out any remaining shame about feeling deeply. Your body knows how to rest when it's no longer working overtime to manage and monitor your emotional expression. Your mind knows how to quiet when it's no longer spinning stories about why your feelings might be wrong. Feel yourself drifting towards sleep as someone who belongs exactly as you are, who contributes something beautiful and necessary to this world simply by being willing to feel authentically. Your sensitivity is not something you need to overcome or outgrow. It's something you need to honor and protect, like tending a sacred flame that brings warmth and light to everyone it touches. Tonight, you sleep as someone who no longer apologizes for tears, who no longer minimizes joy, who no longer takes responsibility for others' discomfort with emotional truth. You sleep as someone who understands that being sensitive in an insensitive world is not a burden, but a calling, not a flaw, but a feature, not too much, but exactly enough. As consciousness fades and sleep embraces you, carry with you the gentle truth that you have never been too much. The world has simply been too little in its capacity to hold the fullness of who you are. But you no longer need the world to change for you to be okay. You are okay exactly as you are, feeling exactly as deeply as you feel, responding exactly as authentically as you respond. Rest now in the revolutionary acceptance of your own beautiful sensitivity. Rest in the knowledge that your healing journey continues even in sleep, that each dream, each moment of rest, each peaceful breath is an act of self-love. Rest as someone who has come home to themselves, who no longer needs to apologize for the gift of feeling deeply in a world that desperately needs more people brave enough to keep their hearts open. Sleep peacefully, sensitive soul. Sleep deeply, knowing you are exactly as you are meant to be. Sleep well, beautiful bridge between the feeling and the felt, the heart and the world, the depth and the surface. Sleep in the truth that you have never needed to apologize for being the most authentically human version of yourself. Your sensitivity is a gift. You are a gift. Rest in that truth tonight and always.